couple weeks ago, I shared a story of an advice that was given from a wise man on how I should be driving in this snowy weather. He reminded me to put two hands on a wheel. He told me to drive very slow, and he told me to look straight ahead of me. However, 4 years later, unfortunately, I found myself being very complacent. And as I was driving to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin in a very snowy weather, I found myself driving with one hand on the wheel. In a snowy highway, I was going 10 miles above the speed limit and also being very, very much distracted. It could be a nightmare to some of the parents out there, and as you can imagine, I slid on the ice, car spun twice, full 360 degrees, and got into a really big accident. I have a picture to show you here what it looked like. That's my beautiful Nissan Altima. His name was Bobby. My last picture I have with Bobby, but man, it was a massive accident, and by God's grace, I was not injured. Everything was fine, and I was in a ditch, and I called 911. The police showed up, and the police looked at me and said, hey, are you okay? You caused the massive property damage. I was like, what are you talking about? He said, hey, you actually broke all the guardrails on the side. And he looked at me and he said, son, you really did go off the rail. And he took out this paper and wrote me a very fat ticket. You use the term called off the rail when something goes out of control. It's not only a car situations when it goes off track, but you tend to say a phrase called off the track to some people who are maybe making some poor life decisions. To some people who is going a little off track, to people who are struggling, there are times when you and I say, hey, this individual is going off the rail. The funny thing is, as we go into our fourth week of our Jesus on the Mic series, we're going to see that Jesus is labeled as going off the rail by the Jewish religious leaders and the Pharisees. And the reason is this: the people are calling Jesus going off the rail because Jesus is performing miracles during Sabbath, and he's allowing his disciples to apparently work during the Sabbath. And because of that, the religious leaders say, hey, you keep saying that you're the Son of God and you're the Messiah, and you're going off the rail because you're not following what it says here in the law book. But as many of you can guess, and what you and I can remember, is Jesus was actually not off the rail, but I believe that Jesus was actually on the rail. People are pointing fingers saying he's going off the rails, but I believe that he's going on staying on the rail because he is simply staying faithful to the calling that has been bestowed upon him. And I believe that you're listening to the story of Jesus getting blamed as going off the rail, but I also believe that you and I are living in a generation where we also face a similar situation as well. At times when we try to stand up for the right thing, we try to stand up for the truth, there are people around us, our neighbors, who point fingers at us saying, hey, these guys, these believers of Jesus Christ, the Christians, are going off the rails. But one of the things that you and I must remember is, we need to focus on our calling. It is really important for us to stay faithful to our calling. And today, as we navigate 19 verses here together in Luke chapter 6, the question that you and I want to answer is, how can you and I stay faithful even in the midst of opposition? How can you and I stay faithful in our calling when people tell us that we are going off the rail? And the three things that I'll be talking about here is that you and I stay faithful by submitting to God, by choosing compassion, and anchoring our calling in prayer. Open up to Luke 6 with me. We're going to be looking at 19 verses together. But if you're a note taker, here is my first point. We'd love to encourage you to remember that our calling submits to God's authority. You and I must remember, if we want to stay faithful to our calling, we must submit to God's authority. When we get to Luke chapter 6, Jesus' ministry is now gaining some attention, which means that now people are following him around. His popularity is actually increasing. But just as the modern world, when popularity increases, the amount of hatred and also criticism increases as well. And this was a case for Jesus as well, because now the religious leaders, they're following Jesus around in anything that he does, trying to point fingers and accuse on the flaws that Jesus might make during his ministry. What this means is that every single step that Jesus is taking is under scrutiny. But in the midst of this tension that Jesus is going through, the real question is not what Jesus is going to do. The real question as we go to the text is a question of in whose submission is Jesus going to submit himself to? Let's go to verse 1 here. Verse 1 starts like this. On a Sabbath, while he was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. I want you to picture the scene here with me. Imagine you're following Jesus around. There was no transportation. They're all walking. It's all the pretty heavy cardio, no water break, and the resources are not same as here right now. The disciples were very hungry. So they're going around and they pluck out some grains. They're rubbing it in their hand and trying to eat those little rices that could even be left over on their hand. Which maybe most of us would think that that is a pretty sad scene. It's not just sad and also very innocent, but from a Jewish perspective, this was a problem for the religious leaders. In Exodus chapter 20, from verse 8 until 10, it says that you are not allowed to work during Sabbath. And what the religious leaders thought was, hey, disciples taking the grains out and rubbing it in their hand, this was an action of them harvesting. So because of that, the religious leaders are saying, oh man, they should not be doing that. And this is a very dangerous point that you and I must remember. Even the ordinary acts of necessity become the points of tension under legalism. Let's take a look at what he says in verse 2 here. But some of the Pharisees said, why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? I believe the normal question, if I see somebody picking up a grain and eating it with their hand, I would say, hey, did you eat something for lunch? Can I buy you lunch? Are you okay? Are you struggling? That is probably the most appropriate question to ask. And by the way, the context is that these are the religious leaders. They're higher ups. They're the deacons. They're the elders. They're the staff. And they're the pastors. And the question that they ask is not saying, hey, how are you doing? The question they ask is, you should not be doing this. Saying, Jesus, how dare you allow your disciples to work during Sabbath? Let's take a look at Jesus' response in verse 3 here. And Jesus answered them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. You must remember the reason that the Pharisees are responding this way is because when God's calling threatens our control, people reach out for the rules. When God's calling threatens our control and our mind and our desire, the normal instinct of human nature is that we reach out for the rules. And then now this continues to Jesus now bringing up saying, hey, you're bringing up the Old Testament, let me do it for you as well. And he now brings up a situation of this renowned king called King David. King David who decided to eat the bread in a sacred in God's house, which can be seen as technically unlawful. But you see that David's action still was clearly within God's heart. You see in the Old Testament, God makes it very clear when he looks at David and say, hey, this young man is a man after my own heart. You see, there's a big difference of thinking, well, David also broke the law, and why would God say that he's a man after my own heart? This is because David understood something that the Pharisees missed, where he's reminded that God's law was never meant to crush people under the weight of religious performance. I'm going to say it again. The God's law that you read in the Old Testament, God's law was never meant to crush people under the weight of religious performance. But instead, it was designed to protect life, to make space for relationship, and for us to point back to our God's character. And this is something that David knew and the Pharisees were actually missing because Pharisees were more concerned with their system and the law book instead of looking at people's souls. But instead, David, you see here, he was more concerned with God's heart, which is a difference between legalism and faithfulness. And the last verse 5, Jesus makes a strong comment when he says this, and he said to them, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus does not argue policy. He's declaring authority. In other words, this is what he's saying, hey, I decide what faithfulness looks like. Jesus is not off the rails. I don't think he's even reckless. I believe that he's grounded where he's showing us that our calling does not submit to people's expectation and the comments. It actually submits to God. But I think a lot of times when you and I live, we know that God has ultimate authority over our nation and our calling, but oftentimes we try to think that our way is much better. Junior year in high school, our soccer team did really well, and we made it to this massive tournament to play in Okinawa, Japan. They flew us, it's the northern parts of Japan. We competed against 8 different international schools all around Far East Asia, from Hong Kong, China, Korea, it goes on. And our team made it to the semifinals. And I was a defender at the time, and it was a massive match. Everyone was watching online, and it was a big competition. And my coach pulled me aside and said, "Hey, Daniel," I was a defender. He said, "I want you to go look at number 10 over there. He may not look dangerous, but he's going to do something. So all you have to do, Daniel," this was during halftime pitch. He says, "just go mark number 10, and that's all your job, and we're going to be good." And the game was tight, and after coach told me what to do, I'm walking back to my field, and I told my partner, I was like saying, "Bro, I don't think number 10 is a problem. I think number 8 is a problem. I think our coach doesn't really know what he's talking about. I'm just going to go mark number 8. You're laughing already, but disobedient heart, just never stopped. I went to the field, and man, I played very hard, except that I was playing with number 8 the whole time. I'm following number 8 around, and it was actually going well, and coach is yelling at me from the side. I'm really shocked that he didn't sub me out. He's like, "Go to number 10, what are you doing?" But I'm sticking with number 8 because in my understanding, number 8 is a problem. The game was won, it was, I think, 1-1. It was a very important game, and I'm not exaggerating. 2 minutes before the game ended, number 10 got the ball, and he scored the game winner. You have no idea how embarrassing that was. That my decision of relying on my own decision and my understanding and my experience resulted in a fat loss that cost all team to lose and take the flight home 1 day early. And my coach pulled me aside after the game. I'm devastated. I'm crying because I feel terrible. And he looked at me and he said, "Daniel, why didn't you stick to my game plan? Why didn't you trust me?" But I think at times you and I go through this situation as well when our coach is our ultimate Abba Father. He makes it so clear in the scripture that he has a great plan for all of our lives here in this room. But at times we think that our thing is much better. We try to find our own calling. We want to make sure that our desire is met. And instead of listening to his instruction, we're sticking to our instruction. Where today I'm here to remind you that he's calling you to trust his plan. And his calling in Proverbs chapter 3 from verse 5 says this: "Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all you do, and he will show you which path to take." Which is why I'm here to remind you, for you to stick to God's calling even when it confuses others. Maybe some of you are in a situation where you're thinking, I feel like God has called me to this area, but I really don't think it makes sense. I'm here to remind you one last time that faithfulness does not have to make sense. Let's move on to our second point as we go to the next verses. If you're taking notes, here's my second point. I want to remind you that calling chooses compassion over control. Let me say it again. The calling chooses our compassion over control. The next verse is in verse 6. It continues here saying, "On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath so that they might find a reason to accuse him." You see, now Jesus is placed into another difficult situation. There is another Sabbath, but there's also another test. Jesus is walking to the church, and now immediately the tensions are rising. And the religious leaders, they're in church. I want you to listen to me carefully. The religious leaders, the pastors, they enter the church building not to listen to the message, not to worship, not to have fellowship. They are there just to simply accuse Jesus. I want you to take a moment here for a second. As you listen to the fact that there is a religious leader coming to church building, not to worship, but to accuse other person, I want to ask you a question now. Who is off the rail? And the verse continues here. In verse 8 says this: "But he knew their thoughts. And he said to the man with the withered hand, 'Come and stand here.' And he rose and stood there." You see that the Pharisees are trying to surround Jesus, trying to accuse him. And I'm here to remind you, that's usually what happens when your control becomes more important than compassion. When your control becomes more than compassion, you come to church building not to worship and to accuse others. And Jesus, you see in verse 8, he knew exactly what they were thinking. But even if he knew it, he still calls the men forward. Because I want you to listen to me, to those who are struggling in pain and suffering. Jesus refuses to let suffering stay hidden just so that you can keep the religious order. Let me say it one more time. To those who are struggling with pain and suffering, I'm here to remind you, Jesus refuses to let suffering stay hidden just so that he can keep the religious order. and that is the Messiah. And it's showing compassion, which is showing that compassion doesn't avoid tension, but it actually exposes the tension. Let's go to verse 9 here. And Jesus said to them, I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good, or to do evil, to save life, or to destroy it? You see, Jesus is not trying to test their logic. He's not trying to commit himself to debating them, but what he's doing is he's actually testing their hearts. Because I want you to notice here for a second that doing nothing is still a choice. And you might think that doing nothing, staying silent is not a problem, it's neutral, but silence is a problem. It is not neutral when it's hurting other people. And what he's reminding us is this, hey, you're choosing to be silent, which you think that is the right thing to do, but mercy calls us to act and do something about it. The last two verses, verse 10 and 11 in this segment, says this, and after looking around at them and all, he said to him, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored. I want you to listen to this, verse 11. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. You see, the people are watching. He knows that he's under the test. He knows that people are going to accuse him and do something terrible to Jesus' life. But you listen to me, he still heals the man anyway on a Sabbath. There's no debate, there's no delay. This was a sign that compassion wins and the man is restored. And you see, the reaction from the people is very obvious because they're infuriated. And this is what usually happens when calling chooses people over policies. Resistance is usually often the cost. And I'm sure that there are some of you who are listening to this and you're kind of confused on, man, I don't know how I should balance God's law versus the act of faith. And recently I watched a video. It was a video of this one, it was like a security camera in a parking lot. And this mother had a little child with her. And I think she was like moving some stuff in her trunk and I have all the grocery bags and she lost her track of her child. And her child was getting distracted and now the child starts bolting, just running towards this really dangerous place where the cars are coming in, okay? And then now, as you can imagine, it's a disaster. It's a disaster for some of the parents out here. And what happens is this lady who was moving the grocery realizes that her child was missing. And she sees the child who is walking and he's about to get hit by the car. And it is really a spectacular moment. The mom throws the grocery away. She is bolting towards the child faster than Usain Bolt, just going so fast. Miraculously, by an inch, grabs a child and gets hit by the car instead. And parents who are listening to this, you're probably not shocked because I believe and I hope that you would probably do the same. The ambulance is not going to show up and say, hey, did that little kid read the sign? He's going to ask one question. Is a kid alive? Friends, I think you're listening to this and I want you to remember this for a second. It's not someone else's story. What the mother did to that child in a parking lot, it's exactly what Jesus Christ did for us. That you and I are also like the little child. There's a warning sign, there's a sign, there is an advice and all these great words that are given to us, but we still let them down because we're a broken wretch. And Paul reminds us in Ephesians that we were the children of wrath. But he says, but by grace and by mercy, Jesus Christ, who decided to jump on the car for us, he got hit for us so that you and I can live. So the reason why you're sitting down here is because you are once a recipient of the compassion. To those who are wrestling with this, I'm here to remind you that all of you might be thinking, I don't know what to do. I feel like the law is more important. I'm here to remind you that Jesus came here not just for the righteous people, but he came here for the sinners. Which is why I'm here to remind you, for our friends and family, for you to choose people over policies even when it's risky. I'm here to remind you there are people in your life who is struggling. Instead of prioritizing yourself with the policies, I want to invite you to choose people even when it's risky. The religion is going to ask you, did you follow the rules? But Jesus is going to ask you with the gospel, I'll take the hit so you can live. That's compassion, that's calling, and that is Christ. As I close this time here, is my last point here. I want to remind you that our calling anchors in prayer. Our calling anchors in prayer. After getting tested in those Sabbath, he starts in verse 12, says this, and in these days he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. Jesus is about to face a huge decision. In the next verse, it's spoiler alert, He's about to pick the 12 disciples. He doesn't rush. He doesn't ask his mentor. He doesn't go ask around for advices. He also does not act under the pressure. The Bible makes it clear he withdraws himself to pray in the moments of solitude. And I want you to notice here for a second that he prayed all night to pick the 12 disciples. And one of the disciples is Judas, who's going to stab him in the back and betray him for 30 silver coins and kill him. I want you to notice here for business owners, I want you to listen. Imagine you're interviewing someone tomorrow, and you know that this guy is a terrible employee. He's gonna sink your whole company down. If you know this fact through a gift of prophecy or something, you're not gonna hire him, right? But Jesus, he knew that there was a bigger plan that God has designed for them. And I'm sure it was a difficult decision, but instead of following his own decision, his own instinct, he decides to isolate himself so that he can be obedient to God's calling. This is an important part of prayer that all of you might be thinking. Prayer is not just you going out to God and just trying to make the ask, not that he would fulfill all your plan to come in prosperity, but actually a prayer, just like Jesus did, a prayer is a time where your will aligns with God's will. And this is what Jesus is doing in verse 12. And verse 13 continues, and when the day came, he called his disciples and chose 12 of them, whom he named apostles. You see the order here. After the night of prayer, then he acted. A lot of the times, you make the decision, you make the call, you've done it already, and you say, well, God, could you please make sure this was the right decision? He's reminding you once again, the Christological order for you to pray is, hey, pray first, seek him first, seek his kingdom, seek that his will be done in your life, and then you act on it. Verse 14 to 16 continues with the name of the disciples. Here are my last couple verses here. Verse 17 and 19. He came down with them and stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the sea coast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and be healed of their diseases. And those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured. And all the crowd sought to touch him, for power came out from him and healed them all. There's a huge crowd trying to push him trying to push him in a powerful way, but Jesus still does not respond impulsively. Because why? Prayer has already anchored his calling. He's not bothered by people's expectation. He's not bothered by people's opinion. He knows where he's going to go with clarity, with the vision, because he already spent his time in prayer. Which is why I'm here to remind you that our calling is not clarified by popularity or people's opinion, but it's anchored in prayer. Which is why I'm here to remind you to pause and pray and let God guide your next step before you act. When I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, early last year in January 2025, and had an event there. It was a Friday night. My buddy and I were going to take the plane back, and it was like a 2 o'clock plane or something like that. Everything was going really great, and it was a beautiful weather. All staff was there. I had a connecting flight in St. Louis, so I'm ready to get on the plane, but for some reason, they made an announcement that the flight's being delayed. And I'm like, man, I'm going to miss my connecting flight. I was pretty frustrated. I wanted to go home, see my wife. And I was like, what's going on? And I went to the lady in the front desk, along with 200 other angry passengers. And I said, what's going on? Like, the weather is beautiful. You got all staff. And the lady says, Mr. Kim, unfortunately, the pilot was doing an instrument check, and they found this little issue, and we have to fix it before we leave. And I'm like, how big is the problem? Like, come on, I got to get home. I'm married. And it became on, and then what happened is, man, the check went for so long, 3 hours, 4 hours delay, and because of that, I actually missed my flight in St. Louis. I had to get a rental car in St. Louis and drive 5 hours to Chicago, which means that this was a huge, massive inconvenience. And I was pretty frustrated the whole 5 to 6 hours that I had there. But then as the time goes, and I'm reflecting my time, I was like thinking, man, I'm actually so grateful for the pilot. This pilot, he could have just heard the 200 angry voices. He could have just missed this instrument check. He could have just gone because the weather is clear, the people are there, everything looks good, let's start going. But this pilot decided to take an intentional moment to pause and do a quick instrument check. And why? He discovered something that was an issue. And when he discovered that something was a problem, now he's going back to his calling and his objective. Why? It's not for them to get there fast. The goal is to bring the passengers to the destination safely. And because of that, I'm here to remind you, a prayer is a time that you're doing an instrument check in your life. Or many of you might be thinking, wow, there's a promotion ahead of me. Wow, there's a great people. God is opening the door. Just because you see the door being open, it does not mean that you act immediately. And I'm not telling you to not do anything. That is not what I'm encouraging you to do. Even if the weather is beautiful, even if it looks incredible, you and I are called to pause and pray and then move. Because that is a way that Christ showed us for us to make a decision.